Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Turning In podcast. My name is Megan. I'm here again with another episode with Dr. Amy Crawford. On today's episode, we talk about IFS and the body. We're discussing different ways that different, physiological symptoms may manifest and how to identify if that is a part or an actual biological thing going on. Just sort of talk about different ways that we can suss out and become a little bit more grounded into our bodies and therefore be able to understand a little bit more what's going on with our psyche sometimes. A lot of times the body keeps the score, which is something that comes up in this episode. I hope that you all enjoy, and as always, thank you again for tuning in to the Turning In podcast. We really appreciate that you choose to spend your time with us, and with that, we will go ahead and jump right into it. Thanks, guys. Hello, Dr. Amy Crawford.
Hello, Megan
How are we
Jones.
doing today? Hello. How
I'm
we
doing
doing?
okay.
We got a nice little kind of cozy, rainy
Mhm.
day today, Friday. Couldn't remember where I was or what time of day or, any of the orientation.
Totally. Yeah, no, I have no. Yeah, I'm oriented by 1, not by 4, perhaps right now. Yeah, it's Friday morning. It's very dark, really dark and rainy. Yeah.
And like oddly warm. It feels kind of like spring this week, and I'm both absolutely loving it and terrified of it, just based on our climate. It is not how it should, quote unquote, should feel this time of year.
No, it's not. Because I'm always cold, so if I'm able to walk out at 5 in the morning to escort my dog to go to the bathroom in rain, and I just have a long sleeve shirt on, that's a problem. So
I wore a short to take my dog out to the bathroom last night, like at 9 p.m. shorts.
Yeah.
Anyways, glad that you're doing well on this nice, cozy, dark, shouldn't be as warm as it is Friday morning.
Spring, rain, and winter. Yes.
Yeah, this should really be like the coldest. Anyways, I'm stoked for today's episode. I realize, you guys, I say that every single episode, and it is what it is. We've got a little bit more of a psychoeducational episode today, which we have not done in quite some time. It's been a lot more conversational interviews for quite a while, and I'm really excited to get a little bit more of that from you. And our topic happens to be about kind of the overlap and understanding of how IFS and our physiological symptoms intertwine, or our body feels. I don't know why
I was like, wow, you just made
so
that really fancy. I was like, basically, it's IFS in the body.
Yeah, why I have to say it like that. Don't know. I'll get curious about that. But sorry, my mic muted. I'm excited about that as somebody who was not particularly in touch with her body for many, many years, or kind of what was going on for many, many years outside of outside of if I was in the gym or like had weight loss goals or this or that. Like, I had no real awareness on the day-to-day outside of a specific environment of what was kind of coming up or going on, and that's still a journey that I'm on, and IFS has helped me so much with that, amongst other things. So I'm really excited to kind of get into that and hear what you have, what you have there. So should we start? I want you to sort of lead, especially that beginning portion of the psychoeducation. Or do you want to start with how different parts, our physiological symptoms may manifest with different parts? We've talked about that a little bit in the past.
Yeah, I'm going to actually back up even way before that.
Okay.
A lot of the stuff I'm referencing can be found in Susan McConnell's book, Somatic IFS book. She's sort of the pioneer of deepening IFS in the body. For those of you craving more, liking to read, her book is phenomenal. It's not super heady, a little heady, but it also has tons of meditations and guided exercises in it for anyone really craving connecting with their bodies more. So a lot of what I'm sharing today will be using her work, which I obviously want to always give credit where credit is due. And I'll be adding my own twists and turns and other people's information in. But to start with, as we know, IFS is considered a psychospiritual therapy model. And that said, it's psycho, meaning psychological, spiritual, because it adds this other element of self into it that other models do not. However, the entry point into our system usually is our body. So there is a huge intersection between part work and the body. Okay, so that has to be understood, like from the most barest bones. Really, after we get consent and kind of do like the preliminary sort of line of questions, if you will, before officially turning in, the very first question we ask is, can you find that part in or around your body? Where are you noticing that part in or around your body? How's it showing up in or around your body? And the reason for that is because our body is what stores, manifests, and really experiences our parts. Our parts are created in our brain. However, our body is where they're held, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
And so in the work of IFS, it's not just releasing the burdens that our parts carry. It's also releasing our body and the places they're held. Okay. And there's a quote that Susan McConnell has said that, reads as parts absorb burdens over the course of a lifetime. The body's awareness, breathing patterns, ability to resonate with others, to move with ease, grace, and freedom, and to give and receive touch are all adversely affected, right? So psychologically, as well as physical injury occurs in the body and can be healed in the body. And so that's really what IFS believes. Bessel van der Kolk's book, The Body Keeps the Score, that title says it all, that when we have an emotional, physical, sexual, spiritual injury, also known as trauma, our body ends up storing that, and IFS works directly with the places it's stored.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
I'm glad you brought up Bessel, because that's immediately kind of where my mind goes when we start talking about this. And I love that quote that you shared, because it ties. Bessel doesn't talk about IFS like at all, and
there's like
not
4
in an
pages.
IFS terms,
yeah.
But it intertwines so well. What you're saying in simple terms is that the body keeps the score. Like we go throughout our lives and we have these experiences psychologically and physically at times with if it's abusive or whatever, and can therefore have all of these systems jacked up, that then if somebody walks up behind you and puts their hand on your shoulder,
Right.
it's like total chaos internally.
Yeah.
And the thought that IFS can deepen not only our understanding of what's going on, so maybe we don't get so jacked up when that happens, or potentially even heal that system, is actually kind of magical and incredible.
Well,
and is my experience.
It really is. And Bessel does actually believe fully in IFS. So he is a huge proponent of IFS. It's one of the only models. There's like 4 or 5 different models that he says works with trauma. And so IFS is one of them. And part of the reason that dovetails into his research and evidence that the body does keep the score is that idea of unblending that we talk about all the time, right?
Mm.
So unblending leads to affect regulation. So when we unblend, our emotions are going to be more regulated. When we are blended, our emotions are dysregulated, right? So one thing we haven't really talked about too much in here is like our nervous system. I mean, we've alluded to it and hinted at it, and I'm not going to geek out majorly right now about it. But when we are blended, basically our nervous system is highly engaged, right? So our nervous system is constantly scanning for cues of safety and danger. Constantly. That's its job, right? Now, again, I said I'm not going to geek out, and I have parts who are already trying to geek out. So our internal system is going to be the most safe, the most balanced, when our protectors know that our X cells are being taken care of by the self. However, most of the time, our protectors don't even know who the heck self is. So as soon as protectors are doing what they do to keep the X cells safe, you can 100% know that our autonomic nervous system is engaged, meaning we are in a fight, flight, or freeze or appease state, right? And even if you think of that from a parts perspective, you can probably identify which categories of parts fall into each of those nervous system responses. So now, when our protectors are burdened, they essentially are tapping on our nervous system nonstop. Okay, so at the very most rudimentary core of IFS, the belief is if blended, our nervous system is activated. So when our nervous system is activated because our protectors are blending, and I mean, our X cells blend too, but often could be both. Our protectors don't have that perspective of self, right? They're only focused on protecting the X cells, and they're not aware of the bigger picture. So the first step's not the right word, but the first point of awareness with IFS being a body-based model is that we are working on helping the nervous system regulate so that we are not emotionally dysregulated. All right. When we're unblending, we have more access to self, and self can then show our parts the bigger picture, which then allows our nervous system to go back to a baseline. You know, this whole window of tolerance thing and polyvagal theory and how all these interplay, same thing, right? So we have to start connecting to our bodies to understand who and what is showing up that's causing the nervous system activation. Now, with that, as you alluded to, Meghan, for many of us, being in our body is terrifying. It can feel super, super, super scary. So naturally, we have parts that react, avoid, dissociate, disconnect, over-identify with being in our body. So your experience of like, gosh, I wasn't really body aware, very embodied, that you shared earlier, super common. Anybody who has trauma, which is most of us to some extent, can either over-identify being in their body, meaning very symptomatic, lots of, I don't want to say psychosomatic because that implies that maybe the experience isn't real, but it may not be medically diagnosable. However, the experience of pain, illness, symptoms, if you will, physical symptoms, can be really over-identified with, or others can swing to the far end of that spectrum and be completely disconnected to their bodies, right? Different ways, different parts translate what they have to do, right?
Well, and can I throw in just a little nugget, which you already said, but I just want to integrate into the conversation as you're talking about, because I use terminology like, oh yeah, your system's jacked up, or or
Yeah.
you're saying like activated and things like that. And I just want to throw in a reminder that when we're saying that, it doesn't just mean and you're going to know the term for this, I can't think of it right now, but like the heightened symptoms, it is fight, flight, and freeze symptoms as well. So when we're saying your system is jacked up, that could mean some of those protectors are online that have you completely in like freeze response
Mhm.
too. It's not
Yeah.
just that you're like activated.
Hypervigilant, paranoid, on edge,
Yeah,
anxious. Those are parts of us showing up, both physiologically and
100%.
parts. But that's that window of tolerance idea, right? Where we all have a window of tolerance, which is our capacity to handle nervous system stress or activation. And I'm super simplifying this. So those of you listening who are like,
Yes,
oh,
of
she could have
course.
done a better job. Well, yeah, I lead 16-hour trainings on this. So yes, I could do a better job. I agree. When we are outside of our window of tolerance, kind of above the line, if you will, that's when we show up more with the fight, kind of fight or run, flee, kind of like more activated energy. Below the line of tolerance is where we're more flat affect, dissociated, disconnected, numb. So yes, both are indicative of an activated nervous system, even if the word activated makes it sound like we're jacked up, right?
Right. Yeah. So I just wanted to reintegrate that
Yeah.
too, because as we're talking about the different parts and how, especially oftentimes our firefighters can be the ones like guiding
Hmm.
either edge of that window of tolerance. I think my mind personally frequently goes to the more heightened
Yeah.
responses when it can
Mhm.
also be those low
Blunted. Yeah, like blunted,
blunted there.
right?
I'm
Like
like,
almost
I'm very
almost lack of,
yeah, exactly.
right?
Almost lack of like numbness, basically. My brain is not formulating words today, which is great for hosting a podcast. But I
But
just
it's
wanted to
convenient that
throw
I'm
that in.
doing most of the talking today, so you don't have to
Yeah.
formulate too many words. So that's
Yes,
helpful.
it's
See, we
perfect.
we got this.
Exactly. So I just wanted to throw that in. And then as you continue on, I think just re-identifying with it, it is so common and
Mhm.
it doesn't necessarily mean anything is wrong. And when we go into having the journey of IFS, there is an inherent need on some level to ground in and understand
Yeah.
kind of those sensations and how important that is. So keep keep
Yeah.
keep on keeping on.
Well, and to really hammer in that idea of when we're blended and what happens to our nervous system is that when we're blended, survival becomes a priority, right? And survival can show up above that line of window of tolerance where we are more jacked up, or below that line of tolerance, which is where we're more blunted and a decrease in affect, if you will. And the whole focus of our protectors when we're blended is neutralizing the exiles by whatever means necessary. And I might even, that word neutralize doesn't fit for me today as much as it sometimes does. It's really like shutting it down, which feels different than neutralizing. It feels like, yeah, just get it out, right? And so essentially, we're constantly trying to help the nervous system by unblending in IFS. And that's how we actually find safety in being in our bodies, right? It I would be very wealthy if I had a dollar for every time a client when they started doing IFS and asked that question, focus in, on this part we're working with and see if you can notice where in or around your body are you feeling it? Where they're like, what do you mean? Right. Right. I mean, like truly, like, what do you mean?
Mhm.
It's
Mhm.
anger. It's anger. Like it's just anger. Yes, but where in your body are you feeling that anger? Maybe it's not in your body because it feels too scary to embody that. Maybe it's outside of you. Maybe it's in your head. But where are you feeling it? And that simple question can like spiral people, well, their parts,
Mhm.
because of how survival has become a priority and has stopped many of us from actually feeling our body and what it's doing in response to the feelings, thoughts, impulses, etc., that we're experiencing. Now, when we're unblended, this allows our nervous system and our parts to basically feel and deal, where it's like, okay, feeling, and I can deal with this in an effective way without getting flooded and doing what my parts do to keep survival the priority. It allows us to be connected. It allows us to co-regulate, not just with the external world, but with our internal world too. And it allows us to take in our own needs as well as the needs of the external world. Okay. So that's really what we're trying to aspire towards. Now, with IFS and the body, our body really is a parts detector, right? We're not ever trying to Sherlock Holmes what parts are showing up, but our body is a parts detector. If we slow down and pay attention, we can start noticing our body first, almost as like the trailhead sign, if you will, like up, gassy stomach, 1.4 miles ahead. I mean, right? Where it's like, oh, I'm getting a gurgly stomach, or I'm getting that like pit in my stomach, or there's pressure in my chest, or there's a pain down my leg. Oh, I'm getting a little dizzy again. Oh, I have another severe headache. Now, please, listeners, know that I am not suggesting biological and medical things I'm not saying those don't exist or that there's not room for that, right?
Right.
There is. And medical diagnoses, physical symptomatology, all legitimate and real. And our parts have interplay with it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to take a moment to just bring up, there was a huge study a while ago around IFS and how healing, beneficial, effective it can be towards rheumatoid arthritis. That was like one of the largest first studies of IFS that was out there. I could pull up right now the date of when it happened and all the summary and everything, but if our listeners really want to see it, we could probably link the study in the notes. But basically what was found is that rheumatoid arthritis obviously is a diagnosis. Now, I have parts that have some belief around some of those diagnoses that are autoimmune, because I do think there are parts that could be involved in manifesting in some of those ways, but I'll leave my potentially conspiracy theory over here to the right. And what we know to be true and what the study found is that with a medical diagnosis, we do have parts that manifest in relationship to said medical diagnosis. And so when we are working with the parts around it, it therefore has an immensely positive outcome for the medical diagnosis, right? Case in point, you have a migraine. It may not be parts that are causing the migraine. It could be barometric pressure, hormones, legitimate medical, physiological things happening. Sure as heck, when you get the migraine, you're going to have parts that have feelings around it. Like, shoot, I have to call into work again and cancel. Oh my gosh.
Mm-hmm.
I can't even get my kid from work. Those are all parts that are showing up in response to the migraine. Okay. Now, that said, working with those parts associated with the migraine are going to help the migraine itself. And that's super important. You just went away, Megan, but the thing was, it said I was still recording, so I don't know how this is going to play out, but
Oh, yeah.
you're back now.
No,
Okay.
no, I think I have no idea what happened. I apologize.
Okay.
Keep going.
Oh, yeah, no, you're fine. So with that said, our parts are always in relationship to whatever's manifesting in our body, whether the manifestation is purely part-led or parts and biology, whatever it is. Okay. And that's pretty astounding. There aren't a lot of, I don't even know if there are, and people can correct me, other therapeutic modalities, somatic experiencing, I'm sure. I do know, would have a similar philosophy, but that's pretty huge to be able to go, oh my gosh. I mean, most people would say, well, yeah, our psychology is involved, of course. Cool, but then what do we do about it? Right? How do we help the relationship between psychology and body manifestations? And IFS fills that gap. I think you were going to say something.
Yeah, there were two little thoughts that came in. One is just, I remember being in a professional venture with you in 2019 as you were teaching IFS, and I had a cold at the time, and I was like coughing, like as I'm like kind of getting introduced to IFS a little bit more. and I was coughing because I had a cold. And I remember coming up to you after and being like, okay, are you telling me that every time I cough, that's a part coming online?
I
And you're like,
remember that. Yeah.
no, you're like,
Yeah.
no, that's not at all. And
Yeah.
I think like I mean, maybe that was a silly question, but I do think on like a rudimentary level, that's sometimes what people can think when you're trying to say like, listen, physiological and biological medical diagnoses are legitimate and are real, and you can
Mm-hmm.
have a cold, and that doesn't mean that a part of you has a cold. Like, you are an
Right.
integrated being. And the orientation, I loved that you gave the migraine, example, because how many of us go to Dr. Google and decide that we have
Mm-hmm.
terminal cancer or terminal illness
I did.
when we
Parts of me did that the other day because I was smelling metal. So yeah.
oh oh yeah, no, how many of
Uh-huh.
us do that,
Yeah.
or whatever, we orient, or our parts orient towards this physiological experience that we're having and create all sorts of stories about it. And I
Exactly.
think, yeah, that's more the reality than that every time I cough when I have a cold, it's it's a part of me
Right.
coming up.
But I
But
do.
just
I'm so glad you brought that up because I do remember fondly, not too long ago, actually, maybe
oh,
11
yep.
months ago,
Mhm,
during an episode of the podcast, actually, when we were
mhm.
doing a session, right? You were having a
Yep,
session and I was leading you through
yep.
that. And you definitely had a part showing up as a cough.
Which is very different because I was not sick.
Right. Exactly. Right. So it's
Mhm.
curious, right? Sometimes parts can show up purely, and this
As
is
a symptom.
actually, yeah, this is actually very perfectly circled because where I was going with the parts detector before, I don't know where I went, but went there because parts of me wanted me to, is that our body is a parts detector. So parts can manifest as physical sensations, pain, or illness by themselves without a
Mhm.
biological underpinning, right? Or parts can be reactive to the parts that are using physical sensations, pain, or illness, or parts can be reactive to the actual biology that's going on, that's causing said sensation, pain, or illness, right? And so, like Megan's example, one point when was sick, she was sick. So parts of her weren't coughing. No, her body was coughing as what bodies do when they're sick. However, there was another time with Megan where we were in session, she was not sick, and all of a sudden parts manifested in this cough, right? We can look at the symbolism in that, but probably very protective based on
Mhm.
where we were going, right? Protective as a means of distraction based on where
Well,
we were going.
and you guys can go back, like, that happened on a podcast episode on the
Yeah.
IFS session. Like, Amy and I she's not my therapist. We don't really do
No,
sessions. So that
no.
was like a recorded IFS session. And so you can kind of, if you're having a little bit of curiosity about the differences here, you can go back and actually see her call me out on that, because I kept muting because I was like
Mhm,
hacking, like hacking
mhm.
along with kind of where we were going. So it's sort of,
Yeah.
you can get a real-time example of that.
Yeah. So now, as we kind of talked a bit about this all, I just want our listeners, those who have maybe been on this for the long haul and the journey of this and have some understanding of the different categories of parts, just spend a moment thinking about how, knowing what managers are, knowing what they do, how do your managers show up in your body, right? Just think about that. And I'm not going to give a long time here, but yeah, how do your managers show up? How do your firefighters show up in your body? How do exiles show up in your body? And if I were to put different language with this, how do our preventative, proactive parts show up in your body? How do our reactive parts show up in the body? How do those wounded, exiled parts show up in the body? Right? And so that brings us to really where I want to go next, which is kind of conceptualizing how the different parts of us do show up physically. So knowing that managers are very proactive, very preventative, really kind of shoulders up, sort of, oftentimes. They can show up in our body in very restrictive, controlling, tense ways, right? Raise your hand, listeners, if any of you have a lot of shoulder tension, neck tension, back tension, jaw, TMJ, right? All of those. I mean, granted, could have you had a hard workout? Yeah, of course, right? I'm really just speaking purely as how parts show up, not necessarily in response to, say, a physical injury. Like I slept wonky last night. I have total pain in my shoulder and neck. That is anatomically a discomfort I'm experiencing right now. And I for sure have parts around it, right? But I'm just talking like our managers right now. So our managers most commonly will show up in our chest, our neck, our jaw, our shoulders, our back, right? They are holding everything. And I'm not trying to get too woo-woo here, but it symbolically makes a lot of sense, right? Our managers are the ones holding this thing together. There's a lot of muscular constriction that goes on based on our managers' jobs. Regardless of what they're doing, they carry a burden of responsibility. Responsibility comes with tension a lot of times, right? Okay. So now firefighters are, I think firefighters and XLs are the more visceral, really like felt in our body in a more obvious type of way. Whereas manager physical sensations often are just so chronic, if you will. They go unnoticed. It's just like, oh yeah, I clench my jaw. I always have a headache. I'm like, my shoulders are sore. They can almost go unnoticed because of the chronicity of how they manifest in our body. Whereas XLs and firefight. Go ahead, Megan. I think you want to say something.
I was just going to say, kind of to a point that you've made in previous episodes about managers and self-like parts, and what you're saying right now is like the chronic nature of them is we identify so much with them so regularly that of course they're going to go unnoticed because that's just like feeling like it's our state of being.
Exactly. Yeah. That's how we cruise through the world, right? Where it's like, yeah, this is just how it is. Right?
Yeah. I feel tense. Or I think the one experience that I have very frequently with, I mean, probably both managers and firefighters is like anxiety that I get in my chest. And that would be kind of for me, again, the podcast isn't about me, but I know that I'm not alone in that. That would probably be the difference where I feel that fluttering in my chest or even in my throat. That's a manager. But what you're saying with moving into the firefighters being like,
it could be manager, it could also be exile.
The anxiety. Oh, I think that there's different. Honestly, I think that I have a lot of systems of anxiety.
Yeah, for sure. Totally. Yeah. Which I think is important. That's important for everyone to know, right? Like,
yeah, 100%. It's not just one. Like, it's not just like, oh, I have anxiety, and so that's a firefighter, manager, exile, etc. It's like, as you delve into it, I genuinely feel like there's a lot of different systems there. And to your point, I mean, it's probably exile, firefighter, and manager in different realms.
Sure. Yep. Yeah.
But that's overcomplicating maybe just, what you're saying is the managers frequently are like tension and a little bit more of the like heady cognitive, we just move about the world that way, thinking sort of things. And the firefighters are more like, I guess, how would you categorize that? Physiological, like strong senses of, gut upset or fast heart rate or sweating or numbness, like full on numbness.
Yeah. And, that really ties into the firefighter stuff we're talking about, right? Because firefighters are committed to escaping the pain through distraction or pleasure seeking, right? Or causing more pain. Okay. Those are the different ways in which our firefighters do what they do. And it's not uncommon for firefighters to be feeling something so viscerally that then they dampen pain with chemicals or food. or self-harm or suicide,
Mm-hmm.
right? Firefighters can also do what they do so well, that they can create an illness to get out of something or risk harming the body to release pain or feel that pleasure. Okay. So firefighters actually have the power to create distractions, if you will, that are so big that cause us to kind of shut down. Right. You know, so managers, more chronic tension, firefighters feel a lot and feel physically a lot, put it out, right? Now with exiles, our exiles are really the parts of us, when we talk about flooding, if you will, or emotionally being dysregulated, our exiles are the parts of us that can be responsible for that. They're the ones who can flood our system and can cause such an intense well of emotion and or physical discomfort that then our managers do what they do and or our firefighters do what they do. Now, with the exiles, a lot of times our exiles will show up more, this might be a gross overgeneralization, but like stomach, bowels, heart, if you will, kind of like solar plexus area. Exiles for trauma, sexual trauma survivors can also show up down in the pelvic region a lot, right? So they also have very strong physical manifestations. Now, something to remember with exiles is that some of our exiles are in utero. They were created while we were still in the womb, or were created when we were so young that they're pre-verbal. So all they know is how to communicate through the body. They don't have words. They don't have experiences that they can translate into language. So for a lot of our exiles, it can actually be their soul experience is communicating through the body.
Can I ask a question about the like in utero specifically? And I don't need, I guess I am asking specifics. Like, what would be an example of, would that be like a traumatic childbirth, like your mother having a traumatic childbirth, or like being under a lot of stress a lot? Like those are where some of those legacy burdens come on, and
so legacy burdens are generally passed. They often start by being passed on in utero. So larger systemic, cultural, gender, those sorts of beliefs often get passed on in utero. It could be a stressful environment, such as an abusive relationship between the mother and the father that the unborn child is experiencing. It could be lack of nutrition, basic needs not being met. It could also be maybe the mother not wanting the child. So a lot of
both the physical and the emotional experience of the mother.
Yeah.
That's kind of what I thought, but I was like, I want a little bit more specific.
Yeah. Or for me, I have an anxious exile. Most of my exiles have some sort of anxiety. But I have an anxious exile that when I did an unburdening with her, she was in utero and she took on my mom's anxiety. And so, so another example, right? If you think of it, the permeability between mother and child in the womb, pretty phenomenal, right? So everything that's coming in is going through.
Well, yeah, and that's biology. Like that's why, like women aren't supposed to eat fish or smoke or drink. Like that's not really something to be argued. Nor is this. I just think that it's very exemplary of that, like the creation of some of those exiles and those systems, because although we may, depending on our belief systems, want to think we're a blank slate when we come out, we have been attached to a fully fledged adult human being moving about the big, scary, beautiful world,
Which
at
has
that
then
point.
been attached to the
Mhm.
generations and ancestors before
Mhm.
them, right? And
Mhm.
that gets into the epigenetic piece, which is so
Mhm.
powerful and a very emerging area of study, as well as intersecting with IFS in really powerful ways,
Mhm.
right? So yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, I didn't mean to derail. I
No.
just wanted some more specifics there, and yeah, it does speak to the reality here. So.
Yeah. And so when we think about parts in the body, our parts are kind of created in our mind, if you will. And then they end up manifesting in our bodies in very different ways. And, I kind of was a bit stereotypical in lumping how some of them may show up as managers, firefighters, exiles, etc. But what we do know is that our parts are stored in our body, trauma is stored in our body. And when our parts are placed in these extreme roles, it's because they've endured what they consider to be traumatic, right? They've endured some experience, event, belief, etc., personally or legacy-wise, cultural burdens, that they have interpreted, made meaning from, that put them in a position to have to do their role extremely, right? So now what often happens is that with trauma, self can get pushed out of the body with trauma, basically, because people are always like, well, what happens to self? Shouldn't have it protected during this time? Self isn't a god. It can't stop bad things from happening. It can't necessarily protect during the event. But what happens is that when or if the emotional, physical, spiritual event feels too dangerous for self to be embodied, our parts won't allow access to self, right? So self can get like almost pushed out, if you will, when it feels too dangerous for self to be embodied. And what's also really interesting, and could be a whole nother topic, so I'm opening a bit of a can of worms here, but in IFS, there's a belief that abuse often worsens. I'm trying to be really calculated with my words. Abuse often worsens when any characteristics of self show up. Perpetrators often see self as a threat, and abuse can worsen. Perpetrators don't love seeing creativity, calm, confidence, courage. And so often what can happen is that self, again, gets pushed out as a result of survival. That goes right back to where we started, right? I thought you were going to say something more. So,
well,
I
just find that really interesting and haven't ever considered that. Like, as in your external experience of whatever that dangerous situation can look like may worsen based on the other person's orientation to our part. So if I'm showing up, calm, curious, confident, compassionate, that could actually potentially put me in more physical, mental, emotional, financial, spiritual danger,
right,
in a situation, like a specific situation like that. I've never considered that. So that just kind of like blew me away a little bit, and is really, it makes a lot of sense. It makes a lot of sense what you're saying about like being in, like when you're in that traumatic experience in physical and psychological fight or flight, it could not be safe for self to show up.
Right. And remembering that our whole nervous system is oriented towards survival and is constantly scanning, parts manifest and do what they do. Right? Which is, sorry, my stomach is like growling. So if y'all are hearing that, my apologies. Interesting. I know. I actually think it's just digesting the bagel I shoved down in my throat real quick before we went on. Maybe a part. Let me check. No, I think it's purely digestion. I have parts associated like, oh, damn, that's loud. So really, there's so much to the body and IFS. And I think as I, zoom out, I think I probably have said most of what I wanted to say. I guess the biggest piece is that we can become more embodied by doing this work in a really beautiful, healthy, balanced, harmonious way. By being with our parts, helping them unblend. That is our path into healing, both of the parts, both in our bodies. And yeah, it's really powerful. Yeah, I mean, that was like, I sounded like a fourth grader saying that. But
No, well, I think to encapsulate the message, yeah, and summarize, it's exactly what you just said. Like there is a general category of experience that we might have depending on the category of parts that is coming up. Again, gross generalization, because we're all going to have our different experience. I love that you talked about the window of tolerance, and I think that's something, if people are interested, there's plenty
yeah.
of resources out there to learn a little bit more about the window of tolerance. And I mean, things that I can certainly link in the show notes. I'd love to link that study.
Polyvagal theory. I mean, there's so many really
It's
great.
basically like the main one that talks about, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's polyvagal. So yeah, there's certainly things that we can resources if you want to further educate yourself on that. And I think the main point being that physiological experiences, medical diagnoses, as legitimate as they are, and as legitimate as our experience is, our psyche is part of that and will orient towards that in every capacity, even to the point where I found it really interesting when you said a lot of the times our firefighters can be the ones, and paraphrasing, but that sometimes manifest that physical sensation to avoid. I found that really interesting. But we are integrated beings, and I think we can't think about this vessel we move through on the planet and those two things being mutually exclusive. It's not like I have a physical ailment and that's all it is, or that I have a psychological feeling experience and that's all it is. Like they intertwine with one another. And IFS for me has been such a wonderful tool, not always comfortable, but such a wonderful tool in understanding my body more.
Well, and that's why you're more embodied now, right? Like,
yeah, no, legitimately, that is
IFS.
why. Like 100%, that is why, is because I learned a little bit more and was able to do this work. And I mean, it really has been a game changer in my day-to-day life. And what you're saying too about how a lot of the times the body is kind of the initial roadmap once you kind of get embodied and slow down. I'll be sitting in a meeting or in an experience, in a conversation, and I will realize what's going on with my body now before I even realize always the feelings that are attached to it. And it's such a juxtaposition to where I was.
Well, 80%, studies say that 80% of our input comes from the top up, meaning into our body first, then hits our brain, so that we can like translate it. So yeah, that is truth. But most of us are living miles away from our body, right? So yeah, that's I mean, yep.
Yeah, it's really cool. It's a really cool experience to be aware. I mean, not that I'm walking around constantly aware of it. I think that might drive me mad, but in the moments where I become aware of it, which is much more frequent now than it used to be, and very, is it separate? I think it's separate and also relevant. I think understanding how IFS orients us to our bodies also does play into our lifestyles and meeting our own needs when we are in self, when it comes to outward physical, like intentional physical movement and actually, being in self or calling on
Right.
other parts to help heal
Mhm.
and cope. I think that that's also a very fair thing to bring up in this episode, which we
I
have
agree.
many episodes to delve further into in
Yeah.
the future, but I think it's all relevant. So,
Yeah.
all of that to be said, I know that you had a potential, I don't know timing wise, if it's appropriate. Do you have time? Do you want to do
It's
kind of
gonna
the
take
meditation?
it'll take longer than what we have
Okay,
available today,
we'll do that another
but
time.
maybe for our next pod we can just do a
Mhm.
short little episode that
Yeah.
walks listeners through that exercise.
Well, yeah, because we've got, like I just alluded to, we have some continuation kind of to this
Mm.
topic in some future episodes. So I think that sounds great.
Mhm.
So we just teased everybody for
Yeah.
what what some resources are that can be upcoming. Anything else as I just rambled on and to recap?
Well, I think my cliff notes is sometimes a cough is just a cough, and sometimes it's more than that. That we can pull from that.
It's true. Take it from
Yeah.
us who've
Yep.
seen it and
Yep.
experienced it. Well, thanks, Amy, for that. I find that really interesting, and I definitely learn something myself every time we do an episode. And there were a couple moments in there that I was like, oh shit, wow, yeah, I didn't quite conceptualize it that way, or like how
Yeah.
that could be. I do want to let everybody know we are officially on YouTube. Our videos are not like our the actual video of Amy and I that will sometimes be behind the scenes are not on there, thank God.
And they never will be. Go ahead.
And they never will be until or unless we decide to actually create some kind of educational video, which will probably be the case eventually. But I did want to let people know who are more YouTube oriented or want another easy way to share some of our content. A good portion of our back catalog is officially uploaded to YouTube. And we have 2 subscribers.
Oh my gosh, that's amazing. And they're not Megan or I. So,
No, they're
uh-oh.
not either of us. So we have a whole 2 subscribers right now, which is hilarious and not something I'm really concerned about. But I thought it was funny when I looked this morning because I didn't let anybody know. So I'm actually kind of curious how
Huh.
people are finding us. But either way, just wanted to kind of share that. And then as we move into February, I guess the challenge is to ground in to our bodies and become a little bit more aware of kind
Yeah.
of what's going on as we're a month into, New Year's resolutions and the upcoming year and all of the plans and exciting things or
Mhm.
whatever our attitudes are. I think that can be the challenge until the next episode. So,
I like it.
all right. Well, thanks everybody for tuning back in to the Turning In podcast with Dr. Amy Crawford and myself, Megan Jones. Really appreciate your time, love, and we will see you next time. Thanks.